Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The blame game is well on its way. As the world deals with the COVID-19 pandemic, many, particularly in the West, fault China for the crisis. Is the West projecting its own failures and weaknesses? Will the West blame China for globalization as well? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest Glenn Diesen in Oslo. He is a professor of higher school of economics, as well as author of The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. In Moscow, of course, we have Dima Babic. He is a political analyst and editor at InnosMe Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. It means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Glenn, let me go to you first in Oslo. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, but the blame game is raging, particularly if you look at American cable stations. American media is very prone to have an enemy. But this enemy, China, it's point out, is a very difficult one to pinpoint because globalization, by definition, was not to create enemies, but was actually try to capture. And so one can make the argument that the Chinese have been wildly successful at globalization, an idea that came from the West. So you can't really have it both ways, but they do want it to have both ways. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, globalization was also intended to be a division of labor where the West would take the center with holding the high value aspects of global value chains. Now, it just happened that China climbed those global value chains very quickly. And so I guess for the West, globalization has taken on a less favorable format. And furthermore, globalization, as we've known it over the past few decades, has been predicated on the idea of very liberal trade. Now, you usually only have liberal trade when there's a clear economic hegemon, because this prevents rivalry. And so you've seen this for a while, that the conditions for globalization has been breaking down. Now, that being said, on the Americans' part, there's some reasonable criticism against China's wet markets, of course, and also this argument that you call viruses based on their origin country. Like, you can make these arguments. However, it would be very dishonest if we don't also recognize that there's a competition here for global leadership, and America is very eager to use this virus now to bash China. And indeed, a lot of our American friends across the pond here are very open about their discomfort that China might actually end up on top. In other words, China might actually come out stronger while the United States might come out weaker. And to add injury to insult, insult to injury, the US really resents the fact that China is positioning itself now as a benign hegemon. So you see the narrative from Beijing is that while the US is hijacking medical supplies from its own allies, China is reaching out and helping out the whole world. So there's a lot. That the US sits there.
But Marcus, I mean, to kind of maybe condense everything that we heard from Glenn is that globalization is working. It's just that the United States wasn't able to take advantage of it in the way it thought it would. Okay, because this pandemic has shown the weaknesses and the frailties of how Americans have participated in this project called globalization, and it's left wanting. Okay, and maybe in a couple weeks' time we will reconvene and we will start to discussing the real economic damage that is being left in the wake of this pandemic. So, I mean, Marcus, it's very simple. I mean, globalization, like it or not, if you don't like the results, then you don't like the country that is winning, quote unquote winning, but not, and they're winning because somehow they are broken the rules. I mean, it seems to me very convoluted with the argument they're trying to make, except for it gets down to racism in many respects. Go ahead, Marcus.
Peter, I'd like to start my first submission from this dimension. I have been an ethical vegan for many years now, and I campaign tirelessly against all forms of animal abuse. And I can say this, that China has some of the worst practices of animal abuse anywhere in the world. They are diabolical, those practices. However, there are also diabolical practices of animal abuse throughout the world. And I will say this, if from this virus, if once this chapter of the virus comes to an end, if the trade, the wildlife trade, And if wet markets in China are abolished, then that will be an extremely positive thing. That would not be political. That would be for the sake of the animal kingdom, for the sake of compassion, for the sake of morality. Now, turning to the geopolitical dimension to the virus, what we have seen in the last few weeks is a re-emergence of two historical themes. First, racism towards Chinese, and secondly, a deep-seated hatred of communism, hysteria over communism. And Peter, I've been monitoring developments in America and in Australia far more closely than developments in Britain. And what I've noticed in America is that the Americans who know and are reluctant to have to accept this, they know that their economy is interlocked with the economy of China. But nonetheless, they have used the episode of the virus to condemn China, to play up the Chinese threat. But in Australia, Australian politicians and journalists are using the virus as an argument to lessen Australia's trade dependence with China. But the Australians are not playing the racist towards Chinese. The Australians are playing the hatred for communism card.
Well, Marcus, let me jump in here. I mean, I find this very, very curious. Okay, I mean, I think that the general public, because of this pandemic, has been reminded that China is ruled by a communist party. But that didn't stop the elites in the West to move their factories there, to hollow out the industrial base of the United States. Being a communist country never stopped them doing that. And all of a sudden, we have this catastrophe that is truly global. And now we're all told it's all because of Chinese communism. I mean, that's just a ridiculous argument to make. And it's a ridiculous argument to make because it doesn't go back to the origins of what globalism is all about. Okay, let me go to Dima here. Nobody forced Western global capital to go to China. The Chinese didn't force them into China. They went there willingly for one reason: huge profits, and the American heartland died in the process here. Nobody wants to have that discussion. They want to discuss the fact that the Chinese are a different race and that they're ruled by a communist party. I think that's a very facile way of looking at this. Go ahead.
Well, indeed, the problem is that when this pandemic ends, the big question, will anything change? Well, I am skeptical about it because when I read in today's The Washington Post the following headline, presumptive Democratic presidential nominee should inoculate himself against post-pandemic skepticism about globalization. So they're already preparing to return to business as usual, despite the terrible tragedy that is happening, a tragedy of biblical proportions. I mean, this story, when the American media was searching for the mass graves in Iran, they were looking for satellite pictures of these graves. And now we have mass burials in the United States, and basically every day in the United States, the number of people dead is comparable to the number of people dead in China during the first months of the epidemic. Excuse me, it reminds me of that famous Psalm of David. He hollowed it out and dug a hole, and he has fallen into the pit of his own making. The American media was talking so much about mass burials in Iran that they missed how their own government has not prepared the country for the pandemic.
But Dima, I'm not really sure it can be business as usual, because let me go to Glenn right now, because however you define flattening the curve, and and if you look at it, the global flattening of the curve, okay, in the wake of all of this is massive. I mean, truly massive economic wreckage. Okay, when there are serious people talking about 30% unemployment in the United States. There wasn't even 30% unemployment during the Great Depression. Okay, I mean, and so how, kind of responding to what Dima said here, it cannot possibly be business as usual. We're going to have to the elites have to be confronted with the situation that they created with supply chains and dependency on others, because this globalization is wonderful in theory. It's all kumbaya stuff. But when you have something like this, a black swan event, you show how weak and poorly thought out this is, and who it works for, to whose advantage. And this is something that's going to be highly political in the months to come. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I would just say that a lot of these trends were already in the making, though. With the economy was already changing to a large extent with the new technologies coming out with the fourth industrial revolution, with more and more automation and power concentrating in digital giants. You already saw that production was being reshored. You saw to some extent a decoupling of global supply chains. But this obviously, yes, but is something much more intense at a much larger scale. So I don't think you can go back to where things were. And indeed, there's difficult to get it done, but also there's very little interest now, given that for a long time globalization was premised on the idea that very liberal ideas that the more integrated economies would be, the more peaceful and cooperative they would be. Now that they see that the globalization is seen more in terms of relative gain, I think it's very unlikely that we can go back to the way things were. I just want to also add that a lot of the rhetoric now, the way this is framed, is also which is also a big reason why we can't go back to the way it was, is this, you can refer to a Cold War. And I'm not sure if I would agree that it's very much rooted in racism. I think it's more seeing it as a civilizational rivalry, because in any Cold War, you have to mobilize your camp. So it is an interest then, especially of the United States, to portray this as being two contrasting forms of government, which are incompatible, deeply ideological. So it's the free world democracies versus the Communist Party. So almost something reassuring back to what we already knew of the Cold War, when you had the good versus bad, and you essentially convince your
millions of Americans buying communist goods, huh? I mean, how are you going to?
Yeah, there are some flaws in the narrative, obviously. But
the thing is that people like their cheap plastic stuff, okay? And are they going to be willing to give up on that? Okay, I doubt it, okay? I mean, this whole decoupling thing is interesting in theory. You know how many decades it will take to decouple from the decades of coupling? It's amazing. Dima, you've been very patient. Jump in.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm very glad that Glenn and Marcus mentioned racism. It's a new kind of racism. Let me just read a quote from a recent article about China, again in the Washington Post. To be sure, between favors in China and the United States. The United States remains a free country, and China doesn't. So this is a new kind of racism. I'm superior to you not because I have white skin and you have black skin or yellow skin. I am superior to you because I have democracy, and you don't have it. I know it from the Washington Post.
Isn't it really interesting? It's very interesting, Marcus. Let me go to you. Is it okay that you can play that? I mean, and this is kind of rekindling the Cold War rhetoric, leader of the free world, and all that kind of stuff, which is very annoying because it doesn't really get to the heart of what drives geopolitics. But I mean, when we get down to that, then that's a cover for not having soul searching for the weaknesses and frailties and the mistakes that the Western governments have made in dealing with this pandemic. I mean, this is a pivot. It's a switch and bait approach, because nobody wants to take responsibility in the West for what the West has done to itself and the world. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, first of all, Peter, I would say that we should resist the temptation to draw parallels with what is happening in the world today and what has happened in the last few years with the Cold War. The Cold War was a remarkably unique period in human history, and what we have seen since from 1992 onwards cannot be compared to the Cold War. But turning to China and the West, despite xenophobia in the West, despite hysteria over communism in the West, the brutal fact for people in Washington, London, and in Canberra is that until the day comes when another country in the world is able to produce cheap goods which households across the world require on a day-to-day basis, and produce those goods on a mass scale as China does, then those countries are going to be dependent on China. So whatever they are saying in Britain and America and Australia, quite frankly, is futile. Now, will the day arrive when another country is able to produce the goods that China produces? Possibly it will do, because it's not as if the Chinese are producing goods that Germany or Japan produces. That is why I believe that China is a giant, but with feet of clay. But nonetheless, at the moment, there is no country in the world producing what China does. Therefore, despite hostility towards the Chinese, despite hostility towards the Chinese Communist Party, countries will remain indefinitely dependent on trade and investment.
Glenn, I want to go back to your last answer here and kind of move it forward. I mean, what does decoupling mean in your mind? Okay, after the last 40 years of globalization, and to reflect upon what we just heard in London. I mean, what does decoupling mean? I mean, autarky from each other, a wall? I mean, no trade whatsoever? I mean, I think that's ludicrous at this point. You know, see, the thing is that I think we can look at the most egregious elements of globalization, you know, and juxtapose that to the necessity in the wake of this crisis of sovereignty. But will we be able to reverse all of globalization? I think that's ludicrous. I think that's a fantasy. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, no, I think with decoupling, I would not expect full autarky. I think rather that countries would designate more of their industries and define them as strategic industries, such as Trump, for example, argued that, you know, if you don't have steel, you don't have a country. Yes, such strategic industries. So, for example, the U.S., a key effort by them is what they refer to as reshoring, bringing production back home. And for the Chinese, they would see, you know, less dependence on the U.S. dollars, transportation corridors. It's strategic, it's key technologies, especially in the tech sector. So I think it will be scaling back on globalization. And again, it's not just this rivalry between the United States and China. There's a lot of domestic need for rethink globalization as well. Keep in mind that neither the political left or the political right have been able to deliver on their ideological commitments. That is, you can't have on the left, redistribution. On the right, you can't protect the traditional values. If you're going to let the market, let market forces be unfettered and unconstrained. So there is already this push in society for internal reasons to scale back on the liberalism which has been embedded in globalization.
But Glenn, hang on here, Glenn. But that comes at a huge cost. Okay, I mean these financial elites. They've made a lot of money off of this. I mean, and I don't see them wanting to walk away from that, because I mean, you're going to have to start building factories again in the United States, and you're going to have to pay people decent wages. I mean, if you want good workers, you're going to have to pay them well, and then your profit margin goes down. I mean, is that a political imperative? I mean, again, this goes against the quote unquote values of economic liberalism. Go ahead.
Well, that's why the populists, both on the right and the left, their discourse tends to frame around the people versus the elite, because the elite are seen as profiting of this. Now, obviously, if you're going to have, for example, on the left, more redistribution or higher wages away from capital and towards labor, then obviously under such conditions, you can't really commit to free trade anyway. So there has to be more tariff, more protectionism. And I think, again, not canceling capitalism, but I think more pre-1980s capitalism, that you will see a bit more of this. Again, maybe in retrospect, we might see this period from 1980s to 2020 as being an exception, a very liberal form of capitalism. And again, countries seeking a little bit more self-sufficiency in terms of their technologies and currencies. But this will be quite natural in history if you see when economic hegemons decline. So, but again, I don't see capitalism being toppled or anything along these lines. And definitely supply chains will remain where they will remain. But much like countries would seek to look after their own food production, which obviously this crisis shows is important, you also have to identify other industries. Would you allow other countries to control your digital space? Would you allow them to control your medical production? So essentially, what are your critical industries? And I think once we start to look at it, more and more of your industries can be defined as critical industries. And I think that's where you're going to see a bit of a decoupling. But obviously, if you want to buy Polish apples, there wouldn't be any need for decoupling in such areas. So,
okay, go ahead.
Well, I wish I could agree with Glenn that there could be a return to pre-1950s capitalism. Wouldn't it be nice? But I'm afraid it's not going to happen. It's too late. And I don't expect fair play from the United States and from the European Union. It didn't start yesterday. It didn't even start with anti-Chinese trade war that President Trump initiated. Basically, already last year, in 2019, Council of Foreign Relations issued a summary called "Is Made in China 2025 a Threat to Global Trade?" Well, Made in China 2025 is a program of Chinese industrial development, basically copied from the German program, Industry 4.0. And some, in the EU and in the United States, they like Germany's Industry 4.0, but they absolutely dismissed the Chinese program simply because it combined the concept of big data, which means basically control over society. Let's face it, it was not invented in China, it was invented in the West, and it's developing everywhere. So the idea was to combine big data with the fourth industrial revolution that Glenn has just mentioned, with new, biotechnologies, aerospace industry, engineering, everything. And suddenly the United States and the EU, they accused China of stealing their technologies simply because the Chinese did not want to become basically an appendix for the West. They wanted Western technology so that they could develop their own industry. Well, after everything happened, I expect that globalization may continue, but it will take a different form because China and Russia cannot trust the United States anymore. They cannot trust the European Union anymore. So I think there will be basically three contours, three big areas of globalization. There will be one around the United States and the EU. There will be another one around Russia and China. And there will be a third one around ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian booming economies, which for their own reasons do not trust China. And they will start their own kind of contour to,
But the interesting question is here. Let me go to Marcus here. I mean, we've used this term Cold War, and maybe we need to find a new term because it makes us think about the past Cold War, which was very, very ideologically driven. This is something that it's more about how you define and to what extent you're willing to pronounce sovereignty. Glenn gave a very good, many good examples there. But I mean, it is all about hegemony, and the West refuses to step aside. I mean, it's the Thucydides trap. This is the best example of it right now. This is a time of decision: cooperate, okay, negotiate, or go to war, okay? And I mean, and war I can use them very loosely, okay, in economic war, for example. But I think it's really incumbent upon the West to come to terms because the Chinese have already decided on their trajectory, and we've seen that they do it with great determination. And if the West doesn't want to negotiate, then China will go its own way. And I think that's bad for the international system. Go ahead, Marcus.
Indeed, Peter. Whilst I hear what Dimitri and Glenn are both arguing when they make reference to capitalism before the 1980s, we should be very mindful not to generalize capitalism before the 1980s, before the advent of Veganism and Thatcherism. because it is my argument that even though capitalism in Britain, for example, before the 1980s, was far more humane compared to the capitalism in Britain today, which is corporate capitalism, nonetheless, it was still very, very harmful for the most vulnerable people in Britain. But at the same time, capitalism before 1980 in countries such as France, Italy, and Germany was far more humane than capitalism in Britain. So my argument is that the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, which you find in the Anglo-Saxon world, Britain, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, is the potent model of capitalism. And that potent model has become all the more poisonous since it manifested itself into corporate capitalism. And Peter, I wouldn't detest globalism if it manifested itself in internationalism, but it doesn't. The problem is that globalism is used by certain countries in the world, principally America and Britain, to impose political, economic, cultural, that's a major factor, cultural and military will on other countries around the world. That is why I loathe globalism.
You know, we're rapidly run out of time. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion here. But the interesting thing is that since we're talking about the United States primarily and China primarily, I think the West has to realize that China is going to draw conclusions from this as well. And the Western elites often fail to understand who their interlocutor is because they always have it from a point of superiority. And I think that we're at a point now where we could miss a very important opportunity of dialogue. But considering the rhetoric that's coming out of the West, because as I said in my introduction, because of weaknesses on their part in the system that they created that benefited a small number of people at the expense of so many of their own people, they won't have that conversation. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. I want to thank my guests in Oslo, London, and in Moscow, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.